Chapter 12 of Old Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cheryl Holmes, M.D. The Old Fairytales by Laura Valentine. Chapter 12. The Beneficent Frog.
There was, once upon a time, a king who sustained, for many years, a constant war against his neighbors. After many battles, his capital was besieged. He was frightened on account of his queen, and entreated her to retire to a castle that he had fortified, and which he had never visited but once. The queen employed prayers and tears to persuade him to allow her to remain with him. She wished to share his fate, and uttered piercing cries when he gently forced her into her chariot to hasten her departure. However, he ordered his guards to accompany her, and promised to absent himself secretly as often as he could to visit her. He soothed her with this promise, though it was scarcely probable that he would be able to fulfill it, for the castle was situated at an immense distance from the capital, in the middle of a thick forest, and, without being acquainted with the roads, it was impossible to discover it. The queen set out, very sorrowful at leaving her husband amid the perils of war. She was conducted by short stages, lest the fatigue of so long a journey should make her ill. At last she arrived at her castle, very uneasy and very low-spirited. After a short repose, she wished to amuse herself by walking about the environs of the castle, but she found nothing to make her cheerful. She looked all around her, but could see nothing save immense deserts, which rather increased than diminished her grief. She looked toward them sorrowfully, and sometimes said, "What a difference between my present abode and the one that I have always hitherto been used to! If I remain here much longer, I shall die. To whom shall I speak in this solitude? With whom can I share my grief? And what have I done to deserve banishment from the king? It seems that he wishes me to feel all the bitterness of his absence by exiling me to this disagreeable castle." In this way she would complain, and although the king wrote to her every day, and sent her very good news about the siege, she became more and more afflicted and determined to return to her husband. But, as the officers who were with her had been ordered not to conduct her back, except a courier were sent expressly for her, she kept her resolution secret, and had a little chariot made, in which there was only room for herself, saying that she intended occasionally to go hunting. She herself guided the horses, and followed so closely on the dogs' heels that the huntsmen could not keep up with her. By this means she made herself mistress of her chariot, and, consequently, had it in her power to go when she liked. There was but one difficulty, which was that she did not know the roads of the forest. But she flattered herself that the gods would conduct her safe through. And after having made a few small sacrifices, she said that she intended to have a grand chase, and wished everybody to be there, that she should go in her chariot, and that everybody should take different roads so as to leave no retreat for the wild beasts. This was done. The young queen, who thought soon to see her husband, had dressed herself to a great advantage. Her hat was covered with feathers of various colors, her vest enriched with precious stones, and her beauty, which was by no means of a common kind, thus set off, made her look like a second Diana. While the company were all occupied with the pleasures of the chase, she slackened her horses' reins, and encouraged them with her voice and 2 or 3 lashes with the whip. After going along at a good round pace, they began to gallop, and then ran away. Their chariot seemed to be borne along by the winds, and could hardly be followed with the eye. The poor queen, now that it was unavailing, repented her temerity. "What have I undertaken?" she said. "How was it possible for me to guide horses so high-spirited and unmanageable? Alas, what will become of me? Ah, if the king thought that I was in such danger as this, what would become of him, he who loves me so tenderly, and who only sent me away from his capital city to place me in greatest safety? Behold how I have repaid his tender care of me." The air resounded with her grievous lamentations. She called on the gods, she invoked the fairies to her assistance, but the gods and the fairies had abandoned her.
The chariot overturned. She had not strength to jump quickly on the ground, and her foot became jammed between the wheel and the axle-tree.
It may be easily imagined that it was only by a miracle that she escaped with her life from so shocking an accident. She lay stretched on the ground at the foot of a tree. She had neither pulse nor voice, and her face was covered in blood. She had been a good while in that dreadful condition, when, opening her eyes, she perceived near her a woman of gigantic size, clothed only in a lion's skin, her arms and legs being naked. Her hair was confined with a dry serpent skin, the head of the serpent hanging over her shoulders. She had a club made of stone in her hand which served for a walking stick to support her, and a quiver full of arrows by her side. Such an extraordinary figure made the queen think that she was dead, for she could not imagine that after such dreadful accidents it was possible for her to be still alive, and, speaking in a very low tone, "I am not surprised," she said, "that so much grief is felt at resolving to die, for what one sees in the other world is very terrible." The giantess, who overheard her, could not help laughing at the queen's idea that she was dead.
"Cheer up,"
she said to her.
"and know that you are among the living, or your destiny will not be the less sorrowful. I am the fairy lioness, and my residence is not far from here. You must come and pass your life with me."
The queen looked at her sorrowfully and said, "If it please you, mistress lioness, to conduct me back to my castle and inform the king what you will accept for my ransom, he loves me so dearly that he will not refuse even half his kingdom."
"No,"
answered the giantess.
"I am rich enough. I have been very dull for some time past at being alone. You have wit. Perhaps you may be able to divert me."
As she said these words, she took the form of a lioness, and, placing the queen on her back, she carried her to the bottom of her terrible cave. When she arrived there, she healed the queen's wounds by means of a liquor with which she rubbed her. How surprised and how grieved was the queen when she found herself in that dreadful abode! It was gained by 10,000 stairs, which led to the center of the earth, where was a large lake of quicksilver, covered with monsters whose various figures might have frightened one less timid than our queen. A few dry roots and horse chestnuts were all that the fairy lioness ever gave the persons who were so unfortunate as to fall into her hands. When it was almost time for the queen to go to bed, the fairy told her that she might make herself a cabin, for that she was going to remain with her all her life. The princess, at these words, could not restrain her tears. "Oh, what have I done," she said, "to deserve being detained here? If my death, which I feel approaching, will give you pleasure, put me to death at once. It is all that I dare hope from your pity, but do not condemn me to a long and miserable existence without my husband." The lioness laughed at her grief, and told her that she advised her to dry her tears, and try to please her, that if she did not do so, she would be the most wretched person in the world. "What must I do, then," said the queen, "to move your heart?"
"I am fond,"
said the fairy to her,
"of fly pies. I wish you to find means of catching enough flies to make me a very large and excellent pie."
"But," answered the queen, "I do not see any at all here, and if there were plenty, it is not light enough to catch them. And if I had caught them, I never made any pastry, so that you have given me a task which I cannot fulfill."
"No matter,"
said the unmerciful lioness.
"I will have what I wish."
The queen made no reply. She thought that, in spite of the cruel fairy, she had but one life to lose, and in the state she then was, what had she to fear? Instead, then, of looking for flies, she seated herself under a yew tree to weep at her ease. She might thus have wept for a long time if she had not heard over her head the sorrowful croaking of a crow. She looked up, and, by the assistance of the little moonlight that lighted the bank, she saw a large crow holding in its bill a frog, which apparently she was about to crunch. "Although nothing happened to save me," said the queen, "I will not neglect to save the life of a poor frog, which is as much afflicted in its way as I am in mine." She made use of the first stick that she laid her hand upon to make the crow let go its hold. The frog fell, lay for some time insensible, and, after a while, recovering its frogly spirits,
"Beautiful Queen,"
it said,
"you are the only kind person whom I've seen in this place since curiosity first brought me here."
"By what miracle are you able to speak, little frog?" answered the Queen. "And who are the people whom you see here? For I have seen no one yet."
"All the monsters with which this lake is covered,"
replied Quenuyeta, that was the frog's name,
"have once been in the world, some kings and others in the confidence of their sovereigns. Their fate sends them here a while, although none of those who come here ever return any better or corrected for their stay."
"I can easily understand," said the Queen, "that the union of many wicked persons will not aid in the reformation. But with regard to you, Mistress Frog, what are you doing here?"
"Curiosity has induced me to come here,"
replied she.
"I am a half-fairy. My power is limited in some things and very extensive in others. If the fairy lioness knew that I were in her dominions, she would put me to death."
"But how is it possible," said the Queen, "that, fairy or half-fairy, a crow should have been about to devour you?"
"Two words will explain that to you,"
said the frog.
"When I wear my little wreath of roses on my head, in which consists my chief power, I fear nothing. But unfortunately I had left it in the marsh when that wicked crow pounced upon me. I confess, madame, that but for you I should now have been dead. And since I owe you my life, if anything lies in my power to alleviate yours, you may command me in whatever way you please."
"Alas, my dear frog,"
said the Queen,
"the wicked fairy who holds me in captivity wants me to make her a fly pie. There are no flies here. If there were any, it is too dark to catch them, and I am in danger of dying under her blows."
"Leave it to me.
said the frog.
Before long I will furnish you with enough."
She then rubbed her body all over with sugar. Then she called out of the pond quite an army of frogs, upward of 6,000 of her acquaintance, and they did the same. They then went to a place crowded with flies, for the wicked fairy had thereabout a magazine of them, purposely for tormenting unfortunate persons in her power.
When they smelt the sugar, they settled on the bodies of the officious frogs,
who then made haste back to where the Queen was. Never was there such a capture of flies, nor a better pie than the Queen made for the fairy lioness. When it was presented to her, she was not a little surprised, not understanding by what means the Queen had managed to catch so many flies. The Queen, being exposed to all the inclemency of the air, which is poisonous, cut some cypress branches to begin building her little house with. The frog generously came to proffer her assistance, and putting herself at the head of those who had been to fetch the flies, the whole of them assisted the Queen to erect a little building, which, when completed, was the prettiest in the world. But the Queen had hardly lain down in it when the monsters of the lake, jealous of her repose, came to torment her with the most deafening and horrible din that until then had ever been heard. She arose, dreadfully terrified, and fled, which was just what the monsters wanted. A dragon, who had formerly tyrannized over one of the finest kingdoms in the world, immediately took possession of her little house. The poor afflicted Queen wished to complain of this, but in truth she was only ridiculed. The monsters whooped at her, and the fairy lioness told her that if she kept dinning such lamentations in her ears, she would soundly beat her. So she was obliged to hold her peace and apply it to the frog, who was the most obliging creature in the world. They wept together, for when she had her wreath of roses on, she could laugh and cry the same as an ordinary person.
"I feel so strong a friendship for you,"
said the frog to the Queen,
"that I will recommence building your little house, though all the monsters of the lake should die with spleen."
She immediately set about cutting the wood, and the Queen's little rural palace took so short a time to build that she went to bed in it that same night. The frog, attentive to all the Queen's wants, had made her a bed a while time. When the wicked fairy understood that the Queen no longer slept upon the ground, she sent for her.
"Tell me immediately, who are the gods or men who protect you?"
She said to her,
"This land, always watered with rain of fire and sulphur, has never yet produced even the value of a leaf of sage, notwithstanding that I learned that odoriferous herbs grow under your footsteps."
"I am ignorant of the cause, madame," answered the queen.
"The humour takes me,"
said the fairy,
"to have a nosegay of the rarest flowers. Try if your good fortune will supply you with one. If it does not, you shall need a good flogging, for I often administer floggings, and always do so marvellously well."
The queen began to cry. Such threats were not agreeable to her, and the impossibility of finding flowers made her despair. She returned to her little house. Her friend the frog called to see her.
"How sorrowful you are,"
said she to the queen. "Alas, dear gossip, is it not enough to make me so? The fairy wants a nosegay of the finest flowers, and where shall I be able to find them? You perceive that there are none here, yet her mandate runs that my life depends upon satisfying her wish."
"Amiable princess,"
said the frog graciously,
"I must try to free you from your embarrassment. There is here a bat, who is the only one with whom I've had any dealings. She is a good creature, and can go faster than I. I will lend her my wreath of roses, by the assistance of which she will be able to find you some flowers."
The queen made her a low curtsy, for there was no means of embracing Quenouilletta. Quenouilletta immediately went to talk with the bat, who, some time afterward, returned, concealing under her wings some very beautiful flowers. The queen made haste to take them to the wicked fairy, who was more surprised than ever, not understanding by what miracle the queen was so befriended upon all occasions. The queen was incessantly devising some means of making her escape. She communicated her wish to the good frog, who said to her,
"Permit me, madame, first of all, to consult my little wreath, and we will then act according to its advice."
She accordingly took it, and, having placed it on some straw, she burned some slips of juniper wood, some capers, and 2 little green peas, and croaked 5 times. Then, the ceremony being finished, she resumed her wreath of roses, to speak like an oracle.
"Fate, which orders all things,"
she said,
"forbids your quitting this place. You will here have a princess more beautiful than the mother of love. For the rest, do not trouble yourself, as time alone will be able to relieve you."
The queen cast down her eyes, and tears forced their way, but she resolved to trust in her friend. "At least you will not abandon me," she said to her. The good frog consoled her as well as she was able. But it is high time to say a few words concerning the king. While his enemies had him besieged in his capital city, he could not be continually sending messengers to the queen. However, having made several sallies and obliged them to retire, he felt much less the happiness of this event, on his own account, than on that of his dear queen, whom he could now recall to his court without danger. He was ignorant of her disaster, none of her officers having dared to go to the city and inform him of it. They had found in the forest the remains of her chariot, and all the Amazonian decorations with which she had adorned herself to go and seek him in, the horses having escaped. As they had no doubt of her being dead, and as they thought she had been devoured, they did not debate among themselves about the expediency of persuading the king that she had died suddenly. At this fatal news, he thought that he himself should die of sorrow. Hair torn, tears shed, mournful cries, sobs, sighs, and other sad privileges of widowhood were indulged in. After having spent several days in retirement, he returned to his capital city, dressed in deep mourning, which he felt more in his heart than his clothes testified. All the ambassadors of the kings, his neighbors, came to condole with him, and after the ceremonials which are inseparable from such an occurrence, he applied himself to giving his subjects an interval of quiet, exempting them from war, and procuring for them an extensive commerce. The queen was ignorant of all this, and she was happier when heaven blessed her with a little princess, as beautiful as Quenouilletta had foretold. She was named Muffette, and with much difficulty the queen obtained leave of the fairy lioness to bring her up, for she was so ferocious that she had a violent longing to eat her. Muffette, the wonder of her time, was already 6 months, when, looking at her with tenderness mixed with sorrow, the queen said incessantly, "Oh, if the king your father saw you, my poor little baby, how glad he would be, how dear you would be to him. But perhaps at this moment he's beginning to forget me. He believes that we are forever buried in the horrors of death. Perhaps, even now, the place in his heart devoted formerly to me is occupied by another." These sorrowful reflections cost her many tears. The frog, who loved her sincerely, seeing her thus crying, said to her one day,
"If you wish it, madame, I will go and find the king, your husband. The journey is long, and I travel slowly, but at last, a little sooner or a little later, I hope to accomplish it."
This proposal could not have been more agreeably received than it was. The queen clasped her hands, and even made Muffette join hers, to show Madame Grenouillette how obliged she should be if she would undertake the journey. She assured her that the king would not be ungrateful. "But," continued she, "of what utility will it be to him to know that I am in this sorrowful abode? It will be impossible for him to rescue me from it."
"Madam,"
replied the frog,
"we must for our part do what depends upon us, and leave the care of the rest to heaven."
They then bade each other adieu. The queen wrote to the king with her own blood on a little scrap of linen, for she had neither ink nor paper. She entreated him to trust in all respects to the worthy frog who had brought him news of her. She was 1 year and 4 days ascending the 10,000 steps that lay between the black plain, where she had left the queen to the world, and she was another year forming her equipage, for she was too proud to be willing to appear at a royal court like a sorry frog from the marsh. She had made a little car, large enough to conveniently hold 2 eggs. It was entirely covered outside with tortoise shell, and lined with the skins of young lizards. She had 50 maids of honor, who were those little green frogs which leap about the meadows. Each of them was mounted on a snail on an English saddle, with her leg on the bough, comporting herself to admiration. Several water rats, dressed as pages, to whom she had confided the care of her person, preceded the snails. In a word, nothing was ever so pretty, especially as her wreath of red roses, always fresh and blooming, became her the best in the world. She was rather vain of her errand, which had made her use rouge and patches. It was even said that she was painted, as are most of the ladies of that country, but on inquiry it was found that it was her enemies who had spread that report of her. She was 7 years on her journey, during which time the queen suffered inexpressible pains and hardships, and, but for the fair Muffette, who consoled her, she would have died over and over again. That wonderful little creature never opened her mouth or spoke a word without delighting her mother. She even softened a little the heart of the fairy lioness, and at last, after the queen had passed 6 years in that horrible sojourn, she allowed her to take her daughter a-hunting, provided that all she killed should be for her. What a pleasure for the poor queen once more to see the sun! She was so unaccustomed to the sight of it that she was fearful of becoming blind. With regard to Muffette, she was so skilful that, though only 5 or 6 years old, nothing escaped her aim. By this means the mother and daughter softened a little the fairy's cruelty. Grenouillette travelled day and night over hill and dale, and at last arrived near the capital city, where the king held his court. She was surprised at seeing, wherever she came, nothing but dancing and feasting. There was laughing, there was singing, and the nearer she approached the town, the greater, she observed, was the joy and festivity. Her majestic equipage surprised everybody. All who saw it followed her, and the crowd became so numerous when she entered the city that she had the greatest difficulty to reach the palace. At that palace everything was magnificent. The king, who had been 9 years a widower, had at last yielded to the prayers of his subjects. He was on the point of marrying a princess, certainly less beautiful than his wife, but who, nevertheless, was very charming. Having quitted the car, the good frog entered the palace, followed by all her cortege. She had no occasion to demand an audience. The monarch, his betrothed, and all the princes were too impatient to know the object of her coming to interrupt her.
"Sir,"
she said,
"I do not know whether the news I bring you will give you joy or sorrow. The wedding which is about to take place convinces me of your infidelity to your queen."
"Her memory is always dear to me,"
said the king, shedding tears which he could not restrain.
"but you must know, gentle frog, that kings do not always what they wish. My subjects have been pressing me to marry for the last 9 years. I owe them heirs, and accordingly have turned my eyes toward this young princess, who appears to me to be charming in every respect."
"I do not advise you to marry her, for polygamy is a hanging matter. Your queen is not dead. Here is a letter written with her blood, which she entrusted to me. You also have a little princess, Muffette, who is more beautiful than all the goddesses."
The king took the rag on which the queen had scrawled a few words. He kissed it, he watered it with his tears, and showed it to all the assembly,
saying that he knew very well his wife's handwriting. He asked the frog 1,000 questions, which she answered with as much wit as liveliness. The bride-elect and the ambassadors, charged with seeing the solemnization of her marriage, made very wry faces.
"How, sir," said the chief of them, "is it possible that you can, on the assertion of such a reptile as this, break off so solemn a marriage? The scum of the marsh has the insolence to come with a lie in her mouth to your court, and enjoys the pleasure of being listened to."
Mr. Ambassador,
said the frog,
learn that I am not the scum of the marsh, and since I must here display my science, fairies and frogs appear.
all the frogs, rats, snails, lizards, and herself at their head, did appear, but no longer in the shape of those dirty little animals. Their figures were tall and majestic, their countenances agreeable, their eyes brighter than stars. Each of them wore a crown of precious stones on his head and a royal mantle on his shoulders, made of velvet and lined with ermine, with a long train which was borne by male and female dwarfs. At the same time, trumpets, kettledrums, hautboys, and drums pierced the clouds with their agreeable and warlike sounds. All the fairies and frogs commenced a ballet so lightly danced that at the least gambade they leaped as high as the ceiling of the saloon. The attentive king and the bride-elect were equally surprised when they saw these honourable Merry Andrews all at once metamorphosed into flowers, which danced none the less. Jasmine, jonquils, violets, pinks, and tuberoses, than when they had legs and feet. It was an animated flower bed, the motions of which were equally grateful to the nose and pleasant to the eye. In a moment the flowers vanished, and were replaced by several fountains. Their waters, rapidly ascending and falling, formed themselves into a large canal, which took its course at the foot of the palace walls. It was covered with little painted and gilded pleasure boats, so pretty and elegant that the princess invited her ambassadors to enter them with her, and take a little trip in them. They were very willing, thinking it was all a play, which would at last terminate in a happy wedding. Directly they had embarked, the pleasure boats, the river, and all the fountains disappeared. The frogs became frogs again. The king asked for his princess. The frog replied,
Sire, you have no right to any princess but the queen your wife. Were I less her friend, I should not have troubled myself about the marriage which you were on the point of contracting. But she has so much merit, and your daughter Moufette is so amiable, that you must not lose a moment in trying to deliver them.
I must confess to you, Mistress Frog,
said the king,
that if I had not believed my wife was dead, there is nothing in the world that I would not have done to see her again.
After the marvels that I have performed in your presence,
replied she,
it appears to me that you ought to be convinced of the truth of my assertions. Leave your kingdom under strict orders, and do not defer your departure. Here is a ring that will furnish you with the means of seeing the queen and of speaking to the fairy lioness, although she is the most terrible creature in the world.
The king, no longer seeing the princess whom he was to have married, felt his passion for her growing very weak, and, on the contrary, that which he had entertained for the queen gaining new ground. He set out, unaccompanied by anyone, after having made very considerable presents to the frog.
Do not be disheartened,
said the latter to him.
You will have formidable difficulties to overcome, but I hope you will succeed in attaining your wish.
The king, comforted by these words, took no other guide than his ring to seek his dear queen. As Moufette increased in size, her beauty improved so much that all the monsters of the Quicksilver Lake fell in love with her. The dragons of terrible shape and size humbled themselves at her feet. Although she had constantly seen them, her beautiful eyes could not become accustomed to them. She fled and took refuge in her mother's arms. "Shall we be here long?" said she to her. "Will our misfortunes never cease?" The queen gave her good hopes to console her, but in her heart she entertained none herself. The long absence of the frog, her profound silence, so long a period passed without any news from the king, all this, I say, afflicted her excessively and gave her no room to hope. The fairy lioness gradually accustomed herself to allow them to go hunting with her. She was dainty and fond of the game which they killed for her, but the only recompense she gave them was either the feet or the head. What was more valuable, however, was their being permitted to enjoy once more the precious light of day. The fairy took the shape of a lioness, The queen and her daughter seated themselves on her back, and in that way they scoured the woods. The king, conducted by his ring, happening to stop for a short time in a forest, saw them pass like an arrow from a bow. He was not perceived by them, but though he wished to follow them, they absolutely vanished from his eyes. Notwithstanding the incessant misfortunes of the queen, her beauty was not changed, and she seemed to him more beautiful than ever. All his former passion rekindled, and, not doubting that the young princess with her was his dear Muffette, he determined to perish 1,000 times rather than abandon his design of rescuing them. The officious ring conducted him to the gloomy abode which had been tenanted by the queen for so many years. He was not a little surprised at descending to the center of the earth, but what he saw there astonished him still more. The fairy lioness, who was ignorant of nothing, knew the day and hour when he was destined to arrive. What would she not have given if fate, in conjunction with herself, had ordered it otherwise? But she resolved at least to oppose all her power to that of the king. She built in the middle of the quicksilver lake a crystal palace, which floated like a wave. She confined the poor queen and her daughter in it, and then addressed all the monsters who were amorous of Muffette, saying,
"You will lose this beautiful princess if you do not interest yourselves with me to defend her against a knight who is coming to carry her off."
The monsters promised to neglect nothing that lay in their power. They surrounded the crystal palace, the lightest of them stationing themselves on the roof and walls, others at the doors, and the remainder in the lake. The king, by the advice of his faithful ring, went first to the fairy's cavern. She was waiting for him in the shape of a lioness. Directly he appeared, she sprang upon him. He wielded his sword with bravery that she had not expected, and as she was raising one of her paws to beat him down, he made a cut at one of her joints and exactly hit her knee. She uttered a loud cry and fell. He went up to her, put his knee on her throat, and swore that he would kill her, and in spite of her invulnerable fury, she could not help being afraid.
"What do you wish me to do?"
she said to him.
"What do you require of me?"
"I mean to punish you,"
replied he proudly,
"for having carried off my wife. And if you do not immediately restore her to me, I will strangle you on the spot."
"Look toward that lake,"
said she,
"and see whether she is in my power."
The king looked in the direction she pointed out to him, and saw the queen and her daughter in the crystal castle, which was floating like a galley without oars or helm on the surface of the quicksilver. His joy and grief were so great that they nearly cost him his life. He called them at the top of his voice, and made himself heard by them, but how to reach them was a question. While he was seeking the means of doing so, the fairy lioness disappeared. He kept running round the shores of the lake. When he arrived on one side, and was very near reaching the transparent palace, it went away from him with incredible swiftness, and his hopes were thus constantly disappointed. The queen, who was fearful that he would presently get tired, called to him not to let his courage fail, that the fairy lioness wished to fatigue him, but that true love cannot be daunted by any difficulties. Thereupon she and Muffette stretched their hands toward him supplicatingly. At that sight the king felt himself strengthened yet again, and, raising his voice, he swore by Styx and Acheron rather to pass the remainder of his life in that sorrowful place than quit it without them. He must have possessed great perseverance, for he passed his time very miserably. The earth, covered with brambles and thorns, served him for bed. His only food was wild fruit, more bitter than gall, and he had incessant battles to fight with the monsters of the lake. Husbands who would endure all this for the sake of seeing their wives once more were certainly contemporary with the fairies, and his conduct sufficiently distinguishes the epoch of my tale. 3 years passed away without the king having any grounds for hoping to attain his end. He was almost in despair. He resolved 100 times to throw himself in the lake, and he would have done so if he could have looked upon such conduct as a remedy for the queen and princess's troubles. He was running, according to his usual custom, first to one side, then to another, when a frightful dragon called him and said,
"If you are willing to swear to me by your crown and scepter, your royal mantle, your wife and daughter, to give me a certain dainty bit to eat that I have fond of, which I shall ask you for when I feel inclined for it. I will take you on my wings, and in spite of all the monsters which cover the lake and guard the crystal castle, I engage that between us we will liberate the queen and the princess Musette.
Ah, my dear dragon,
cried the king.
I swear to give you and all your dragonish kind whatever you please to eat, and will always remain your grateful debtor.
Do not bind yourself.
Replied the dragon.
If you do not intend to keep your word, for in that case, such terrible misfortunes will happen that you will remember them all the rest of your life.
The king redoubled his protestations. He was dying with impatience to deliver his dear queen. He mounted on the dragon's back, the same as he would have done on the finest horse in the world. The monsters came to meet them and opposed their passage. They fought, and nothing was heard but the sharp hissing of serpents, and nothing seen but sulphur and saltpetre falling indiscriminately. At last the king reached the castle. The efforts were there renewed. Bats, owls, and ravens all opposed his entrance, but the dragon, with his claws, teeth, and tail, crushed to atoms the most daring among them. The queen, on her side, who witnessed that dreadful conflict, by dint of kicking with her feet, broke pieces from the walls, and made of them arms to assist her dear husband. They were at last victorious. They met, and the enchantment was dissolved by a thunderbolt which fell into the lake and dried it up. The officious dragon disappeared on the instant, with all the other monsters, and the king, without being able to divine by what means, was transported to his capital city. He found himself with the queen and Muffette, seated in a magnificent saloon, at a table spread with a delicious repast. Never was astonishment equal to theirs, or joy greater. All the subjects hastened to see their queen and the young princess, who, as a climax to the prodigy, was so superbly dressed that their sight could hardly endure the dazzling luster of the precious stones. It is easy to imagine that the pleasure of all kinds was the chief business of the happy court. There were masquerades, races for rings, tournaments which attracted the greatest princes in the world, and Muffette's beautiful eyes detained them all. Among those who appeared, the handsomest and most skilful of them, the Prince Muffy was always bore off the palm. Nothing was heard but applause. Everybody admired him, and the young Muffette, who had till then been always among the dragons and serpents of the lake, could not avoid doing justice to Muffy's merit. He never let a day pass without showing her fresh gallantries, for he was passionately fond of her, and having determined to establish his pretensions, he informed the king and queen that his principality was of an extent and beauty that merited particular attention. The king told him that Muffette was at liberty to choose herself a husband, and that he would contradict her in nothing, that he must strive to please her, as it was the only means of obtaining his wish. The prince was in ecstasies at this answer. He had learned at several meetings that he was not indifferent to her, and having at last declared himself to her, she told him that if he did not become her husband, she would have no one else. Muffy, transported with joy, threw himself at her feet, and conjured her, in the most tender terms, not to forget the declaration she had made. He immediately hastened to the king and queen's apartment, and gave them an account of the progress of his passion for Muffette, and begged them not to defer his happiness. They gave their consent with pleasure, for Prince Muffy was so accomplished that he alone seemed worthy of possessing the admirable Muffette. The king wished to betroth them before Muffy returned to his kingdom, where he had to go to give orders for his marriage, for he would rather never have set out than go away without certain assurances that he should be made happy on his return. The Princess Muffette could not bid him adieu without shedding many tears. She had undefinable sensations which afflicted her, and the queen, seeing the prince overwhelmed with grief, gave him her daughter's portrait, entreating him by the love he bore them both that the entry he was going to order should not be so magnificent as to retard in the least his return. He said,
Madame, I never obeyed you with so much pleasure as I shall on this occasion. My heart is too much interested in it to allow me to neglect the means of making myself happy.
He departed with expedition, and the Princess Muffette, while awaiting his return, occupied herself with music, and the instrument she had learned to play only a few months back. She performed on to admiration. One day, as she was in the queen's room, the king entered, his face covered with tears, and taking his daughter's hand,
"Oh, my child,"
said he.
"Oh, unfortunate father, unlucky king that I am."
He could say no more. Sighs choked his utterance. The queen and princess, dreadfully frightened, asked him what was the matter, and after a while he told him that a monstrous giant had just arrived, calling himself ambassador from the dragon of the lake, who, pursuant to the promise exacted by him from the king for aiding him to fight and conquer the monsters, was come to demand the Princess Muffette, to the end of eating her in a pie, that he was bound by a terrible oath to give him whatever he should ask for, and in those days breaking one's word was unknown. On hearing the sorrowful news, the queen uttered dreadful cries, folding the princess in her arms.
"They shall rather take my life,"
said she,
"than persuade me to deliver my daughter to the monster. Let him take our kingdom and all that we possess. Unnatural father, could you consent to such a shocking barbarity? What? Make my child into a pie? I cannot endure the thought. Send the cruel ambassador here. Perhaps my grief may soften him."
The king made no reply, but went to speak to the giant, and led him to the queen's presence. She threw himself at his feet, and, with her daughter, conjured him to have pity on them, and persuade the dragon to take all they had, but save Muffette's life. But he answered that that did not at all depend on him, and that the dragon was too obstinate and too dainty, that when he took it into his head to eat any delicate morsel, the gods themselves could not remove his longing, that he counselled them as a friend to do the thing with a good grace, as otherwise the most dreadful misfortunes might follow. At these words the queen fainted away, and the princess would have done so likewise, only her assistance was necessary to her mother. This sorrowful news was no sooner spread in the palace than it became known to all the town. Nothing was heard but weeping and groans, for Muffette was adored. The king could not decide to give her to the giant, and the giant, who had already been staying several days, began to get tired, and threatened in a dreadful manner. However, the king and queen said, "What worse can happen to us? When the dragon of the lake comes to devour us, we shall be no longer afflicted. But if our Muffette is made into a pie, we shall be undone." Thereupon the giant informed them that he had received news from his master, and that if the princess was willing to marry a certain nephew of his, he consented to allow her to live. For the rest, that the nephew was a very handsome prince, and that she might live very happily with him. This proposal soothed a little their majesties' grief. The queen spoke to the princess, but she found her still more averse to this marriage than to death.
"I am incapable, madame,"
said Muffette,
"of preserving my life by an act of infidelity. You promised me Prince Muffy, and I will never marry any other. Let me die. The close of my life will secure the peace of your own."
The king entered. He said to his daughter all that the fondest tenderness could dictate. She remained unchanged in her sentiments, and finally it was resolved to conduct her to the summit of a high mountain, whence the dragon of the lake was to come and fetch her. Everything was prepared for this sorrowful sacrifice. The sacrifices of Iphigenia and of Psyche could not have been more mournful. Nothing was to be seen but black clothes and pale and doleful countenances. 400 young ladies of the highest quality dressed themselves in long white garments and put on cypress crowns to accompany her. She was carried in a black velvet open sedan, so that everybody might behold this masterpiece of beauty. Her hair was scattered over her shoulders and tied with crape, and the crown on her head was of jasmine and marigold. She only appeared moved by the grief of the king and queen, who were following, overwhelmed with the most profound grief. The giant, armed at all points, marched by the side of the princess's sedan, and looking at her with a greedy eye, seemed as though he felt pretty certain of eating his share of her. The air resounded with sighs and sobs. The road was flooded with the tears that were shed.
"Ah, Frog, Frog!"
cried the queen. "You have abandoned me! Alas, why did you grant me your assistance in the gloomy plain, if you refuse it at present? Happy should I have been had I died there! I should not, then, have seen all my hopes deceived today. I should not have seen my dear Moufette on the point of being devoured." While she was making these lamentations, they still kept moving forward, walking, however, very slowly, and at last they arrived at the summit of that fatal mountain. There they redoubled their cries and sorrow to such a degree that nothing ever was so mournful. The giant requested everybody to bid the princess adieu and return. They retired immediately, for in those days people were very unsophisticated, and always did what they could not help doing with a good grace. The king and queen, when they had reached some distance, ascended another mountain with all their court, that they might thence observe all that happened to the princess. In effect, they had not been there long before they saw a dragon nearly 1.5 miles long in the air. Although he had 6 large wings, his body was so heavy that he could hardly fly, and it was covered with large blue scales and long fiery darts, his tail being disposed in 50 folds and a half. Each of his claws was as large as a windmill, and inside his open jaws was a triple row of teeth as large as those of an elephant. But as he was gradually advancing, the dear and faithful frog, mounted on a sparrowhawk, flew rapidly toward Prince Muffy. She wore her wreath of roses, and though he was locked in his closet, she entered it without a key.
"What are you doing here, unfortunate lover?" she said. "You are dreaming of the charms of Moufette, who is at this moment exposed to the most terrible misfortune. Here, then, is a rose leaf. By blowing on it, I will transform it into an excellent horse, as you shall see."
Immediately a white horse made his appearance. She gave him a sword 6 ells in length and lighter than a feather. She clothed him in a single diamond, which fitted him like a suit of clothes, and although it was harder than a rock, it was so flexible that it did not the least constrain his motions in any respect.
"Depart,"
said Grenouillette to him.
"Run, fly to the defense of her whom you love. The horse which I give you will take you where she is. When you have effected her deliverance, inform her of the share I have had in it."
"Generous fairy,"
cried the prince,
"I cannot at present manifest all my gratitude, but I declare that I will always be your very faithful slave."
He mounted his horse, which immediately galloped off, and made better speed than 3 of the best hunters, so that he arrived in a very short time at the summit of the mountain, where he saw his dear princess by herself, and the frightful dragon slowly drawing near. He became furious, and attempted to spring upon the prince, but the 6 ells long sword was of so good a temper that he could handle it just as he liked, sometimes burying it up to the hilt in the monster's body, and at others using it as a whip. The prince would not have failed to feel the strength of his claws, but for the diamond dress, which was impenetrable. Moufette had recognized him a long way off, for the diamond which covered him was very bright and clear, so that she was seized with the most mortal apprehension of which woman is susceptible. But the king and queen began to feel in their heart a few rays of hope, for it was very extraordinary to see a horse and a prince in a diamond case, armed with a formidable sword, arrive at so opportune a moment and fight with so much bravery. The king put his hat on his walking stick, and the queen fastened her handkerchief to the end of a piece of wood, to make signs to the prince and encourage him. All their cortege did the same. But in fact it was unnecessary. His courage alone and the peril to which he saw his mistress exposed was sufficient to excite him. What mighty efforts he made! The earth was strewed with darts, claws, horns, wings, and scales of the dragon. His blood flowed from 1,000 wounds. It was quite blue, and the horse's was quite green, which made a singular combination of colors on the ground. The prince fell 5 times, always rising again himself. He watched his opportunity to remount his horse, and then such fighting ensued that nothing was ever like it felt. At last the dragon's strength was exhausted. He fell, and the prince dealt him a wound which left a fearful gash. And what is almost incredible, but is nevertheless as true as the rest of the tale, is that the most beautiful and charming prince that was ever seen issued forth from that large wound. His coat was of blue velvet, with a gold ground, embroidered all over with pearls. On his head he wore a little Greek morion, shaded with white feathers. He ran with open arms, and, embracing Prince Muffy,
"What do I not owe you, my generous liberator?"
said he to him.
"You who have just delivered me from the most frightful prison that ever monarch was confined in.
I was condemned to that punishment by the fairy lioness. 16 years I have languished there, and her power was such that, in spite of my own will, she would have forced me to devour this adorable princess. Conduct me to her feet that I may explain my misfortune.
Prince Muffy, surprised and delighted with so astounding an adventure, was in no respect behind this prince in complaisance. They hastened to join the beautiful Muffette, who for her part thanked the gods 1,000 times for so unexpected a happiness. The king, queen, and all the court were already near her. They were all speaking at once, not one of them being able to distinguish what the others said. There were almost as many tears shed for joy as there had been recently shed for grief. At last, that nothing might be wanting to the happiness of all present, the good frog appeared in the air, mounted on a sparrowhawk, which had little golden bells attached to its feet. When they heard the tinkle tinkle, they all looked up. They saw her wreath of roses shine like a little sun, the frog herself being as beautiful as Aurora. The queen advanced toward her and took one of her little paws. Then the wise frog metamorphosed herself and appeared like a noble queen. Her face was the most agreeable in the world.
"I come,"
cried she,
"to crown the fidelity of the Princess Muffette. She preferred exposing her life to changing her sentiments. This example is rare in the present period, but it will be much more so in the ages to come."
She then took 2 myrtle crowns, and with them crowned the happy pair who loved each other so tenderly, and making 3 strokes with her wand, all the bones of the dragon rose and formed a triumphal arch in commemoration of the important event which had just taken place. Then that fair and numerous troop journeyed toward the city, singing wedding songs with as much gaiety as they had sorrowfully mourned the sacrifice of the princess. The wedding was only deferred until the next day. It may be easily imagined with what joy it was celebrated.
End of Chapter 12. The Beneficent Frog. Recorded by Cheryl Holmes, M.D.